Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be Torah-based Nevuah, which some people in English call prophecy, the differences between Nevi'im. So, in a previous video, at least two or three of them, I've talked about the issue of Nevuah and what it is and exactly what it means. But one of the things that happened recently is I got a question concerning exactly how, the things I was saying, if it really does hold up. I think, especially in light of the way that people who don't use the Hebrew text and don't hold by, Torath Mosheh, how they view it, and also, like, I think how the way it's viewed within the ranks of different missionaries, for example. So I'm going to describe in this video exactly what exactly does the Torah mean when, for example, it says that, Moshe Rabbeinu had one type of nevuah and all the other Nevi'im have different types of nevuah. What exactly does the Tanakh mean? And what do the Jews who hold by the Torah who know Hebrew, what do we mean by that? So that's what I'm going to cover in this video. So what I need to do to be able to show, as always, I find that the annotate function I use, helps out in pointing things out, or otherwise I'm just kind of reading things to you in Hebrew. And the Hebrew is going to be very important to this video. So I'm going to start there. So, in order to understand how this works, one has to start further into the Torah. And the reason is very simple. In order to understand exactly how, according to the Torah, Nevuah works and what it even is, you have to start with Hashem, the creator of all things, description of it. When, basically the background story is that Moshe Rabbeinu, his sister and his brother, or mainly his sister, at one point asked this question when she sees that Moshe is separated from his wife because of the leadership role he's taken amongst the people of Israel as, a type of Navi, a type of prophet or leader of the people of Israel, to where he could speak to Hashem at any point and Hashem would approach him at any point. And that required him basically to be, as some sources say, it's almost as if he wasn't like human anymore. Essentially as if he was like amongst like the malach, malachim. So one of the things that happened is that his sister Miriam asked, her brother Aaron, well, we're prophets just like him. Are we supposed to also separate from our spouses? Why is he, why is he doing that basically? And Hashem calls them in and explains to them the difference between the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, or what you would say in English, the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Nevuah of everyone else, literally, amongst the Jewish people. So what it starts with is in the book of Numbers 12:6. It mentions the following. Wayomer Shimuna Devorah Im Yeh Nevi'achem Adonai B'mer'o Elob Ethwado B'halom Adaber Ba. Translating what's here, and it's called Bemidbar in Hebrew. In English, you would say Numbers 12:6. What it says is the following: that Hashem says to Miriam and also to Aaron. He calls the three of them together to the tent of meeting, as people say it in English, or the tabernacle, the Oel Moed in Hebrew. So Hashem says to them, "Listen to my words." Essentially, if there will be amongst you a Navi is someone who is given insight. I did a video about this. I'll try to see if I can link it below in the description that describes exactly what a Navi is. But it's essentially a Jew who keeps Torah, who has a certain insight that Hashem gives them. And Hashem explains how this works between anyone who's not Moshe Rabbeinu, before and after Moshe Rabbeinu, and how it works with Moshe Rabbeinu himself. So it says, if any of you will be, like, anyone will be a Navi, Hashem, basically will appear to them, in a mar'o in Hebrew. So bamar'o is a specific word that has a specific meaning to it. The word actually comes from like a type of like vision. So it's like saying a mar'o, it's like a type of vision. And one of the explanations is, for example, that, it's like a kind of someone being between awake and sleep. Or there are some situations where it's like, someone could be sleeping. That explains that part later. And it says, to them, I will, make myself known, or I will be known in a dream. And that's how Shem speaks to them. So there are two situations that are described here. That there's one situation where you have a person who's in a kind of a state between sleep and awake, and that Hashem, speaks to them through Nevuah, in this state. And that there's another state where the person is asleep and they have a dream that Hashem speaks to them through the dream. And then, the Torah, the oral Torah also explains how the Jewish people are supposed to verify that someone actually had either one of these. Because anyone can say, well, I had a vision and I saw this thing. But the first step is they have to be someone who keeps the Torah. and they have to be someone who's known to keep the Torah in the Jewish community. And then further, they have to be someone who is known, to have this kind of connection to Hashem. And the way that that's verified is through what's called the Sanhedrin, the Mosaic court in Jerusalem, or you could say the Sanhedrin, or the Bet Din Hagadol. So, for example, a person doesn't show up and say, I'm a Navi, and then talk to like an average person, average Jew, an Israeli, and then start trying to tell them, well, Hashem spoke to me and said, blah, blah, blah. Alone, in order for it to be something that the nation of Israel should listen to, they have to go to the Sanhedrin because those are the people who know the Torah correctly. So let's continue and look at what Hashem says about this state of the two states of being Mar'al and the Behalom, the like having this vision, where Hashem speaks to them or in a dream. So those are the two things we're looking at in this particular setting. Okay. So then we continue and a little bit further, Hashem says in Bimidbar, Numbers 12, 7 through 8, Lo chen avdi Moshe, b'chol beti ne'amon hu. So essentially what Hashem says is that the two states I just mentioned, are not what, Moshe, for my servant Moshe Rabbeinu, that, not Moshe Rabbeinu for him, but Moshe Rabbeinu for us, for Moshe ben Amram, that the situation is different. It's not like that for him at all. And because, for example, it's almost like saying that, he is basically, Hashem has opened up a certain thing to Moshe Rabbeinu that's different than everyone else. So he says here, pe adaber bo, umar'a v'lo bechidot, uthmunat Adonai yabit. And I talked about this in the previous video when I talked about the issue of Nevuah and what a maloch is. And essentially what it says is that Moshe Rabbeinu, Hashem specifically says that Hashem speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu like peh to peh, basically meaning that, for example, that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't have this issue of having a mara, and also he doesn't have what's called chidot. Chidot, one way the ways to try to describe it, it's almost like saying that within these states, there's like issues of metaphors and things like that. And the Navi, actually is able to see what those are. And, when they wake up, when they're out of that state of Nevuah, they're able to kind of put that together and explain to people exactly what needs to be explained. Where it says about Moshe Rabbeinu, Hatum Uthmunath Adonai Yabit. So Uthmunath is like saying that Moshe Rabbeinu is able to see straight to the point without, any kind of metaphor, things like that, and he's able to like almost like glance at Hashem. Now, the way that this is explained to understand it, one of the examples given I think in the Talmud, in some of the Midrashim, it's almost as if Moshe Rabbeinu was looking through one either unlit lens or like kind of barely lit lens, or an unclear lens. And the rest of the Nevi'im, the rest of the people who are like prophets, if you will, amongst the people of Israel, were looking through like 15 or 20. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to realize his limitation in saying that I'm not fully seeing Hashem. I'm seeing Hashem through one and clear lens, where everyone else is not able to fully understand that, but they're seeing Hashem through 15 to 16 different lenses. So that's why you can have a Navi who says that he saw Hashem sitting on like a certain throne, with this and that, and he's seeing a lot of metaphor within his Nevuah, where Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see to the point that I'm not fully seeing Hashem. I'm able to see what is, like almost like the word yabit here is almost like saying to glance at. So it's like saying if you say that with the Tumunah of Hashem, almost as like this like form of the issue, Moshe Rabbeinu is able to glance at it, where everyone else is not able to like really see it or glance at it. They're able to experience it in a further distance from Moshe Rabbeinu. So then here are our considerations for going forward. Statements about Nevuah. Nevuah is where a person is either in sleep or dreaming or in a vision state, between sleep and awake. Okay, so that's what that tells us. And the words that we're going to be looking for in the Tanakh, whenever it talks about this issue, the making the distinction between Moshe Rabbeinu and other Nevi'im, or even, what we'll see in a little bit, the original state that Moshe Rabbeinu was in before, Mount Sinai, is we'll look for words for mar'eh or yera or yara. We'll also look for any statement that says Hayah Davar Adonai or Davar Hashem. Oh, sorry, Davar Hashem, Hayah Davar Hashem or Davar Hashem Asher Hoyo. And these two statements mean like almost like the word came upon someone. And the way that it's mentioned when you say Hoyo, it's like suddenly, and it's without their control. So Moshe Rabbeinu was something different where he was able to talk to Hashem and have Nevuah with Hashem at any time he wanted, where all the other Nevi'im had to wait for Hashem to give it to them, if Hashem even gave it to them at all. So the wording that's used often in most of the prophets, we'll see in just a second, is going to be Hoyo Davar Hashem, Davar Hashem Asher Hoyo. So these are like a cultural linguistic statements that let you know that, for example, a person was experiencing Nevuah either through a dream or either through having a waking vision. Machazeh or chazeh or hazon is also another word you use usually for like a waking vision. So someone is kind of between the state of awake and asleep. They have this vision from Hashem, and basically, that's one of the things that the different Nevi'im had, different than Moshe Rabbeinu, for example. And that's one of the things we look at and know, what type of, what type of Nevuah we're looking at. And then also there's some statements that are a little bit less frequent. We're like Masal Davar Hashem, why he Davar Hashem. So essentially, Davar is like saying like a word, for example. It's like singular in this version, but usually when it means like Davar, it's like saying more than just like one word. But this is one of the things when you look at interpreting Hebrew into like let's say English, you could literally translate this as like one word came down, like from this person, from Hashem. But again, we know that it means something more than that. So let's look at what Nevuah was like prior to Moshe Rabbeinu to see exactly when we talk about what's called the Avot in Hebrew. Avot, meaning like Avraham, Abraham, Yitzhak, Isaac, and Yaakov, meaning Jacob. When we talk about the forefathers of the people of Israel, how did they experience the creator of all things? Did they have, a situation like where some people claim that, Hashem appeared to like the various Nevi'im, the various prophets, he appeared physically to Avraham. He appeared physically to Yitzhak. I mean, appeared physically to Yaakov. We'll see in just a second that that's not the case. That what actually was happening in front of them was this kind of vision-like state, like we said before, or a dream by night, for example, where Hashem was communicating with them, and it was in their own visions. This idea that they were seeing Hashem when really they were looking through, let's say, the 15 to 20 different lenses we spoke about, where Moshe Rabbeinu is able to see directly to the point that, Hashem is not a man and Hashem is not human and Hashem is not physically appearing to people, but Hashem is, basically contacting people through Nevuah. So let's start in one of the first places we want to look at, and that's with Avraham. And when we look at when his name was Avram, before his name was changed by Hashem, and this is in Bereshit, Genesis 15:1, and it says the following: Ahar הדבורים האלה היה דבר אדוני al Avram במחזה lemor. So remember in the previous part of the video, we talked about this statement, היה דבר אדוני, and then also b'machazeh. Machazeh meaning like a daytime vision. And then like this, Hayah Devar Adonai is almost like saying the word of Hashem just kind of suddenly came to like Avraham or Avram. That he didn't, sit there and, and try to, he didn't open up his mouth, start talking to Hashem, and Hashem starts talking his back. But essentially that Hashem chose the time, and it happened to him, when Hashem was ready, but not when he wanted it, for example. Not meaning that he didn't want it, but meaning that he couldn't like choose when Hashem would like, speak to him or give him nevuah. So again, the statements we're looking at is Hoyo Davar Adonai and B'machazeh. So as we said earlier, and within the understanding of how Hebrew works, these two statements basically mean that, he was having a type of mare, meaning a mare is one of the statements we made that, this like a vision. And this particular one is like a daytime being between sleep and like sleep, sleep and awake, for example. So then we can go a little bit further in the Torah and look at Esau, the son of Abraham, Isaac, son of Abraham. In Bereshit, Genesis 26:24, it says, Vayero Elob Adonai balaylo hahu, Vayomer Onochi Elohei Avraham Ovicho. So in this one, Hashem, appears to, it says Vayero, so it lets us know it's a type of mare, a maro. It happened by Lilo at night. And this is when Hashem appeared to, Yitzhak, Isaac, and, said to him, Wayomar, Onochi, I am Elohei Avraham. I am the Elohim of Avraham, Ovicho, your father. So I am the mighty one of your father. I'm the, source of creation of all things, but I'm, who your father has told you or taught you about. So again, this happens in the form of a Wayero, Amara, by Lailo. So Hashem does not, for example, physically appear as like a human being or anything like that. It's a matter of that this is like, a nighttime dream or nighttime vision that, he's basically appearing to Yitzhak. So then if we continue in Bereshit, Genesis 28, verses 10, 12, and 16, skipping around, we have a situation where we look at and it says about Yaakov, Jacob, says, Vayetze Yaakov, mi be'er shova, vayelech horono. So this is where the Torah tells us that Yaakov was going to Haran, when he was leaving his family because of the conflict between him and his brother Esau. And it continues in verse 12 and says, Vaya holom, והנה סולם, מוצב ארצו וראשו מגיע השמיימו, והנה מלאכי האלוהים עולים ויורדים בה. So he says, for example, here in the Torah, that that at night, basically, Yaakov or Jacob had a dream, and then he looked and saw, looked up in this dream and saw like this ladder that was going up between like if you will, Shemaim, which is like beyond our world and to our world. Um, and there were different Malochim, of Elohim, Malochi Elohim, they were going up and going down. So then it says that, going on to verse 16, ויגץ יעקב משענותו, ויאמר אכן, יש אדוני במקום הזה, ואנוכי לא ידעתי. So it says at the end of his dream, essentially, that, he, at the end of his sleep, this is why Yigatz at the end of Mishonotho is like sleep. And, he says when he wakes up that this, basically Hashem is in this place and that, I didn't know that. So essentially, he had a dream and he sees some things that were messages from Hashem and Nevuah. And then he wakes up and says, okay, well, Hashem is in this place. And I didn't know that initially, but, Hashem is in this place. So let's look at the transition of Moshe Rabbeinu from his initial Nevuah to the point when the Torah received at Mount Sinai, when, that, basically changed. Okay, so if we look in Shemoth, Exodus 3, verses 2 and 4, we find the following. It says, Wayero Maloch Adonai Elob Bala Bath Esh Mitoch Hasana Wayar Wihine Sana Bo'er Bo'esh Wahasana Enenu Ukol. So translated, it says Wayero. So remember we said Wayero is a type of Mara, and that's a type of Nevuah that, basically either comes, from having a vision or something like that. And it says like Wayero Maloch. So like a Maloch appeared like an Amare to Moshe Rabbeinu. This is when Moshe Rabbeinu was, first came. He was doing work for his father-in-law, to be a shepherd, and then he came across like basically a burning bush, as they say in English, but in Hebrew it's called a sanah. So he comes to the sanah and he sees that like it's consumed with fire, but he notices it's not burning up, and that within this fire that he sees in the Saneh when it's not burning up, that's when there's the appearance of this Moloch that's there. Remember in the previous videos I mentioned how Moloch is almost like one way of representing it in English would be almost like saying a element of nature, an element of Nevuah that Hashem is expressing to the person in this format that we said earlier of what the word Mareh is, for example. So essentially this like, fire that doesn't burn up the plant, for example, is like the malach, itself. So, people say, in English, angels, but malach is really not, the angel is really not a good word because people's visions of what angel is or their idea of an angel is like people with wings and things like that. Where this is saying that the malach itself was basically, in the form of this fire that was, not consuming this plant, and that's what it says here. It wasn't being consumed. And then it goes on in verse 4, where it says, Wayar Adonai, or, Wayar Hashem, ki sor leroth, Wayikro Elob, Elohim, mitoch asana, Wayomer Moshe, Moshe, Wayomer Hineni. So it says here that Hashem, using the name Yod-Heh appeared to him, and basically it says the way, why he called to him, to Moshe Rabbeinu, Metoch Hasana. So we know that the beginning of Moshe Rabbeinu's like Nevuah, when he first had Nevuah, he received it the same way that everybody else did initially. That, it was like by way of Maloch, and it was by way of Hashem giving him a message that was in, some form of Mara, okay, as we mentioned earlier. Okay, so if we go a little bit further, that we see a transition here, where in Shemoth, Exodus 3:6, it says the following: "Vayomer Onochi Elohei Avicho, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchok, Elohei Yaakov, Vayaster Moshe Ponob, Ki Yore Me Habit Al Ho Elohim." So here, when we translate it, this is the transition we see where it says that Moshe, Hashem, starts speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, I am the Elohe, the Elohim of your father, which some people like translate either as your fathers in general, like plural your fathers, or just his particular father, Amram. And then he says, I'm the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Yitzchok, Isaac, of Abraham, Isaac, and I'm the Elohim of Yaakov. And then this is called Othnoho. So Athanochothol is almost like a semicolon in English, where it's like a stop and thought in this particular pasuk, this particular sentence. And then it says the following when we know that there's a break here between the two thoughts. And it says, Wayaster Moshe. So Hashem, Moshe hides, for example, Panov, his face, Ki Yore, he like had Amara, almost like a vision. And, or like, he's seeing through Nevuah. And this is where it gets interesting. In the blue, where it says Me habit, which is like to glance, al ho Elohim. So it's almost like saying that he had a glance at ho Elohim. And one of the understandings of ho Elohim, of course, is that the word Elohim basically means power or strength. So it's almost like saying if you'd had like a glance at the totality or some element of the totality of the power of Hashem, basically in his situation he like hit his face because it was like basically something where you'd be overwhelmed at that point, especially this being his first time having this kind of interaction. So we see that this is the point where it starts to transition, where nobody else is told to have done a mehabit, like almost like glanced at, Hashem in this way, or glanced at the power of Hashem, because Elohim, if it means power or strength, it's almost like saying he had a glance at the power of Hashem. And one way I would say that is like a metaphor of looking at it. Imagine if someone were to see, let's just say, have the ability to see how thermodynamics works across the universe, just for like a second. Because of the fact that we're so limited, on this planet, compared to the universe, someone probably would turn away and say, like, whoa, that was big, even though it's so small compared to like what's really out there. So then we look in Shemoth, Exodus 6, 2 through 3, and it says the following: "V'daber Elohim el Moshe, v'yomer Elob, ani Adonai." So this is a part of the Torah where Moshe Rabbeinu has, gone to, tell Paro, the Pharaoh, basically what Hashem has said about letting the people of Israel go. And then like, basically, it doesn't work. That the Paro basically says, nope, not doing it. So it says a little bit later in verse 3, وإيرو על أברهم על يسحق ועל יעקב באל שדוי משמי Hashem or Adonai Yud He Wah He Lo Nodati Lohem. So this is where we start to see more of that transition where Hashem says, "Wo ero," which like meaning I appeared, but in the form of mare, maro, meaning that like we said, like visions, things like that, like visions that of being between awake and sleep, or like by night. And it says to Avraham, to Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So to the forefathers of the Israeli people, that's how Hashem appeared in the form of this mara. Um, and then it tells you that there's a difference between what Moshe Rabbeinu is experiencing, even what the people of Israel soon experience at Mount Sinai, and between, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where it says El Shaddai, and basically an El Shaddai, it's like one of the terms used to describe the creator, and it has a specific meaning to it, which I won't get into now. It says Ushmi Yud He Wah, the name of Hashem, the Shem Meforash, Lo Nodati Lahem. So this wasn't known to them. So what this means is that prior to the generations before Moshe Rabbeinu, and prior to Moshe Rabbeinu, essentially the element of how Hashem interacts with the people, with reality, the Jewish people, with the name of Hashem, wasn't known to them, to Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So this tells you that there was a difference between what they experienced and what Moshe Rabbeinu experienced as a Navi. So there was an element of Nevuah that wasn't available to them at that time. That they understood a certain element of it, and they received it in the way of like the Mara, the way of we said before. But that's how they experienced it, and it was different than all the of Moshe Rabbeinu, and even the way the people of Israel received the Torah at Mount Sinai when the Commandments were given. So now let's look at Nevuah after Moshe Rabbeinu and see if we see a link between before Moshe Rabbeinu, the time of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov in terms of the wording, and after. So again, let's rewind and go back over what statements we're going to be looking at. We remember that one of the statements used is Mara, which we saw before that Moshe Rabbeinu was, so brother and sister were told that to all the other Nevi'im that Hashem appears to them in Mara, or in like a chalom, a dream, so this is like vision or a dream. And these are the words that are used. We also know that we saw earlier that at one point, Avraham is said that Hoyo Davar Adonai, to him basically. And we know that this is one of the statements that was used to him, that it kind of like happened upon him. It's almost like saying the word of Hashem happened upon him. So it's like he didn't have control over it. He didn't like choose it. It just kind of happened upon him. Um, And we know that the word machazeh or chazeh or chazon also is like a type of vision. That's a word used. And then also we know that at some point we're going to be looking for Masad Davar Hashem, Wahi Davar Hashem. So that's going to be our markers for telling us the type of nevuah that prior to Moshe Rabbeinu and after Moshe Rabbeinu, what was available to them. Meaning that, for example, they didn't have Hashem appearing to them, as some people think. That some people think that Avraham Avinu, Hashem physically appeared to him. Where that's not the way that the Torah says it. And also, a person has to understand what these terms mean. So let's look through the Nevi'im that come after Moshe Rabbeinu and see exactly what does the Hebrew text of the Tanach say about what type of interaction they had and the connection that we can see before Moshe Rabbeinu. So let's look first at Yeshayahu, Isaiah 1:1. It says, Chazon Yeshayahu, Ven Omutz, Asher Hozo, Al Yehuda, V'Yerushalayim. So the word used, hazon, we saw that as one of the words that tells us that's a vision. For example, like a waking vision between sleep and awake. And it uses the word hazah, which is also the same kind of word. Okay, so we see it twice. I didn't mark it in red here. So we see twice that this word is used to describe Yeshayahu at the very beginning. So we know that everything that comes after is an expression of the same idea, that he had like these waking visions. And we know that there are times where he uses language that is based upon his type of nevuah. And this is one of the things that is actually stated that, the prophets like Isaiah, it's almost as if they were looking through a number of different unclear lenses, like maybe say 15 different lenses, for example, or 20 different lenses, or so on and so on, depending on the Navi, where Moshe Rabbeinu was only looking through one, and he knew he was looking through one, where all the other Nevi'im, it wasn't clear to them that they were looking through an unclear lens. So then we look at the next Navi, Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, in 1 through 2. Chapter 1, chapter verses 1 through 2. It says, Divrei Yirmiyahu, ben Chelagiyahu, min hakohanim, asher ba'anotho, ba'anothot, ba'ares bin Yamin, asher hayo davar Adonai Eloh. So it says these are the words basically of Yirmiyahu, son of Hilkiyahu, from the Kohanim, and basically Asher Banot Be'eretz Binyamin, in the land of Binyamin, and it says which Hayo Davar Adonai, so like it came upon him, the word of Hashem kind of came upon him, Elov to him. So we know that this is the same statement Hayo Davar Adonai we saw earlier. So then we look at Yehezkel or Ezekiel chapter 1, 3 and verses 3 and 4. And it says, Hoyo Hoyo Devar Adonai Ale Yehezkel ben Buzi HaKohen. And then going to verse 4, it says, Wo'ero Wehino Ruach Sa'ara Ba'o Min Hasafon. So here it says, Hoyo, so it was, Hoyo Davar Adonai. So like it came upon him again, same kind of language we saw earlier. For Avraham, we saw it for, basically Yeshayahu, that the word of Hashem just came upon him. And came to Yehezkel. Yehezkel is how you pronounce Ezekiel's name in Hebrew. In reality, he was the son of Buzi, the Cohen. So he was from the Kohanim, if you like people say in English, the priestly family, of Aaron, the descendants of Aaron. So in verse 4, it says Wa'era. So it's like the vision that we mentioned, Mara. Wa'era. Wahine. And thus, or like suddenly, or here. Ruach Sa'ara. So um, it's like almost like a wind of like, a very like strong wind came upon from the north. Okay, so we see the same kind of language here. Hoyo Davar Adonai, or Davar, Hoyo Davar Hashem, depending how you want to say it, Yud He Wah He. And, the use of the word Wa'ero, of the same kind of word we said earlier of Amara, or Mare. And then we look in Hosea 1:1. Looking for verse 1. Devar Adonai asher hoyo ali Hoshea Ba'ari. So same language. Devar Hashem asher hoyo. So it's like the same thing, the word of Hashem which came upon him. So then we go to Yoel. Same issue. Yoel 1:1. Devar Adonai asher hoyo ali Yoel ben Pethuel. So the word of Hashem that came upon Yoel, son of Pethuel. We go to Amos. Divrei Amos. Asher hayo benogadim, benogadim, mitogoa, mitagoa, asher chozo al Yisrael. So we see that these are the words of Amos, the Divrei Amos, Asher hayo, which kind of like came about. It gives the location where it came about. Then it says Asher chozo. The word Hazor, like the same thing we said about the vision, waking vision, Al Israel. So he saw a vision about the people, about Israel, the people of Israel, or those in northern Israel. So we look at the prophet Ovadia, and the same thing, Hazon Ovadia, Ko Omer Adonai Elohim. So here we see that the Chazon, the word of the vision that we mentioned earlier, was upon Avadio, and basically it was like what said, thus says like Hashem, but this term using the word Adon, like almost like master or ruler of, and then the name of Hashem, Yod He Wah He. So then we look at Yonah in the beginning of the book of Jonah, or in English I put it here as Yonah, but usually in English people say Jonah with a J, but that's because there's like no J in Hebrew, it's Yonah. So it says, why he davar Adonai al Yonah ben Amitai lemor. So why he davar Adonai? It's the same kind of thing like hoyo. Why he is a similar from the similar root, and the var Adonai. So it's like again the word of Hashem came upon him. So then we look at the prophet Micha. It says davar Adonai asher hoyo al Micho. Same language, same thing we've been seeing before. Then we look at Nahum. Masa Ninaweh Sefer Hazon. Nahum Ho Alagoshi. So it says like, basically like this, there was a book, a sefer, a scroll of the Chazon, the vision of Nahum. Okay, so the same kind of words, remember we used earlier. So then if we go further, looks like okay, it looks like I had a mix up here. I put Yonah again and Micha again, but then also there's Habakkuk. So Habakkuk, it says Hamaso Asher Hozo, the word Hozo again, Habakkuk Hanavi. Okay, and then looking at Sophia, the prophet Sophia, it says, Davar Adonai asher hoyo ala Sophia ben Kushi ben Jadaliyo ben Amariyo ben Hiskiyahu. So same word, Davar Adonai asher hoyo. Then we look at Haggai. Haggai, biyom echod lachodesh hoyo Davar Adonai biyad Haggai hanovi. So the first, the first day of the month, there was like the word of Hashem that came upon it came upon the hand of Haggai Hanavi, the Haggai the prophet, and then Zechariah, b'chodesh Hashmini bishnat shtayim the dor Yowash hoyo davar Adonai ala Zechariah ben Barachyo ben Ido Hanavi lemor. So the same thing with Zechariah, this in the eighth month in the year of this king the Dor Yawash, the Haya Davar Adonai, the word of Hashem came upon Zachariah, son of Berachio, son of Ido, a Navi, to say Malachi. He says Masa Davar Adonai Al Yisrael Biyad Malachi. I didn't do the right here, but it's here where we started the Masa Davar Adonai. So it's like the word of Hashem was lifted up to like Yisrael by the hand of Malachi. So in conclusion, we go back and we look at what was said in the book of Bamidbar, Numbers 12:7 through 8. So we saw that earlier that it told us that that Moshe Rabbeinu does not receive Nevuah like all the other prophets. So it says that he does not receive by word of Mareh. At least after a certain point he didn't. Especially after the giving of the Torah Mount Sinai. When he first was a prophet, that's how it was appeared to him. Then afterwards it became something different. And lo bachidot, almost like saying like metaphors or something that was symbolic, or things like that. And then it says Uthmunat Adonai Yabit. So it's like the focus he had was he could see the truth of the matter without having to have like these different types of metaphors that are presented. We could see the matter as it was, and he could glance almost. It's almost like saying he could glance at the honor of Hashem or the glory of Hashem. And again, one of the ways it's represented in Jewish text is like saying that, for example, he essentially was like looking through one unclear lens, versus all the other prophets, including those before him and after him, were looking through many different lenses. So this is the thing that the Torah is teaching here. And this is one of the reasons that when people try to go and say, okay, well, I want to start at the beginning of the Torah, and then make a conclusion about something at the beginning, the problem they face is the following. When it comes to the text itself, the Jewish understanding of the Hebrew text is not that it's written in a straightforward manner, meaning it isn't like you start at Bereshit in Genesis and then at Devarim and everything's just like one straight line going through. There are situations where, in order to understand everything that came up in Genesis, you would have to understand what's mentioned in Bimidbar, especially here when it comes to Nevuah, because this is the explanation of how Nevuah works. So everything that happened beforehand, you know, based upon this, how to understand that. So, for example, if you have Yaakov saying that he saw the face of Hashem, you have to realize that's him saying that. In his estimation, at nighttime, having experience with Hashem while he's asleep, for example, is in his mind saying, I saw Hashem face to face, and he's overwhelmed by it. But at a certain point, we're told, like by Jewish sources, that when Moshe Rabbeinu got to a certain point after Mount Sinai, that he wasn't overwhelmed by it. That he was like almost like it's like some people, like some sources say, it's almost as if he became a malach, and that he was able to stand in front of the presence of Hashem to the level that Hashem gave it to him, and basically stand and do the work that Hashem asked him, had him do, and that he was 100% dedicated to doing that work of Hashem. And that's one of the reasons that says Uthmunat Adonai Yabit, where no one else has mentioned that Uthmunat Adonai Yabit, that almost like this. Timunah in modern Hebrew is used to mention like a picture, but it's almost like there's a certain element of like the form of, that Hashem gives things that he was able to glance at, where all the other prophets weren't glancing at it, that they were basically having to have it in forms of dreams and things like that, where we're told in, our tradition that Moshe Rabbeinu was never asleep, at the time, especially after the giving the Torah at Mount Sinai, that he wasn't asleep when he received it, that, at one point he says that he was on the Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights and he didn't sleep, he didn't eat. So I would say, like, if you want to use a kind of a sci-fi kind of metaphor for it, it's almost like saying he was in some altered state somewhere else, but he was physically there in this altered state, and that all the other prophets only experienced an altered state in their dreams or in visions, but he was like beyond that. And that's one of the reasons that when it says that when he came back down, he had to cover his face because of the fact that, like one interpretation is that he was physically glowing because it's like physically he was like somewhere else, if you will. And there's others that say he was just that his expression of who he was as a person changed because of the contact that he had with Hashem, and thus he can't be the same kind of person anymore. And thus, as a leader of the people of Israel, he was 100% dedicated to teaching the Torah of Am Yisrael. And because of the fact that he already had children, he was able to like be able to say, okay, I can't be physically my wife anymore because I'm in a different state and I have to be ready at all times for Hashem to be able to come to me, talk to me, and for me to go to Hashem. And that made him, if you will, different, for example. And that's, he's the highest Navi, the highest of Navim that ever happened. And many sources say that, for example, even when we get to the times of Mashiach, that, Moshe Rabbeinu will still be above that level, that Mashiach will be close to it. And he'll be, as wise as, like, for example, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, but he won't be at the exact level of, Moshe Rabbeinu. And I think the best way to maybe say it is like, maybe he'll be at the level of, for example, Yehoshua ben Nun. Joshua, the student of Moshe Rabbeinu, who also had a pretty high level close to Hashem, because of the fact that he learned from Moshe Rabbeinu. So this is, how this works out. Was made by somebody who requested an answer to a certain question, and this is how we understand exactly when we say the differences between Nevuah in Hebrew. This is where we understand it from, and it's directly based upon the Tanakh and the Hebrew of the Tanakh itself. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.